Hi. To my great pleasure and surprise, the previous two videos that I did about Mali were very well received. A lot of you said, hey, this is great. And quite a few of you said, we'd actually like more about Mali, and we like this deep dive kind of thing, so please have at it. I'm more than happy to oblige, if for no other reason than because I'm delighted to have an excuse not to have to think about, write about, or talk about the Middle East and the Iran war. So thank you for your interest in something completely different. Now, as for the videos I do about foreign militaries, I'm going to keep doing them, but the advantage that they have is that they're kind of like evergreen topics. They're less topical, less dated, so I want to deal with Mali now because it's in the headlines, and you're going to be seeing, unfortunately, for bad reasons, I think more and more headlines about Mali in the next weeks and months to come. So this is going to help you understand what you're going to be seeing. I did realize, however, when looking over or thinking about my previous videos, that I inadvertently contributed to a profound misconception about Mali and about the conflicts in Mali. I fueled it, I've added to it, and thus I want this video to correct that misconception. See, like the last video I did, to some extent the previous one, I ended up talking a whole lot about northern Mali and about the Tuaregs. The fact that some of members of the Tuareg community have been rebelling and are rebelling now, and they're driving part of the insurgency. Plus, Tuaregs and some other groups have played a disproportionate role in the jihad, right, amongst the terrorist groups. So I ended up focusing on that. And the reason why I did that is because most of the commentary on Mali that I've seen coming out in the last few weeks and months gets it wrong. It's this portrayal of northern-southern relations and the Tuareg and all this kind of stuff is just so oversimplistic. It's lacking far too much nuance, and I thought I can do better, so I made my videos. However, this contributed to a problem inadvertently, which is that so much of this commentary would associate Mali's conflicts with the north and with the Tuaregs and the other people who live up in the north. But this is a problem because it's just not true. The problem isn't the north, at least not anymore. Rather, the problem in the north has been eclipsed by something else, a separate conflict that has emerged. It's piggybacked on the first conflict. It's fueled by the first conflict. But the reality is a separate conflict, which is the conflict that exists in central Mali. You have a different cast of characters. It's being driven by a different set of political root causes and dynamics and all that kind of thing. It's taken off because of its own reasons. And so much so that sometime around 2016, 2017, if you looked at the violent incidents that you could see using the data from ACLED, ACLED, which is this wonderful organization that collects violent incident data, you can see that there's a geographic shift. The epicenter of jihadist violence shifted to central Mali. This is a huge problem for a number of reasons. One reason is that, as I said in my previous videos, only maybe just under 10% of Mali's population even lives up in the north, and it's far away. And there's not a lot of economic activity, which means if you lose the north, big deal. You lose Kidal, big deal. I know there's going to be a lot of gnashing of teeth because of that. A lot of Malians are going to get upset. You know, they have this vision of the country being one and united. All right, fine. But the reality is, if you cut off Kidal or Minak or things like that, it really won't affect anybody else. The center is different. Central Mali has, among other things, 25% of Mali's population. It's also economically very productive in terms of agriculture and whatnot. And it borders southern Mali, the rest of Mali. So what happens in central Mali doesn't stay in central Mali. It spills over and affects the rest. And it already has. A lot of the insurgent groups that were active in central Mali are now active in southern Mali. It's the central Malian jihadists that are playing a major role in bringing the jihad to southern Mali, not the northern Malian jihadists who are just different. It's a different problem. And if you were to create some sort of political peace process like the Algiers Accords of, when was it, 2015? Which is all about the state and the Tuaregs. Whatever the value of that might be, it's actually relevant for what's going on in central Mali. So even if Bamako and the Tuareg rebel group were to reach some sort of accommodation, and I kind of hope that they do, but it doesn't matter. Again, I know a lot of Malians going to be upset about that, but it doesn't really matter. Central Mali is an entirely different thing. And a deal with northern Mali isn't going to contribute to peace in central Mali. Different actors, different dynamics, different root causes. And that's what I think Mali really needs to be focused on, because that is what can kill Mali, not the far north. So let's forget about northern Mali. Let's forget about the Tuaregs. We want to talk about the center. We want to talk about Fulanis. That's a dominant ethnic group in central Mali. I don't know if it's proportionately, but they're very concentrated there. And they're sort of the main protagonists in the story that I'm going to tell. And we're going to talk about a 19th century Fulani jihadist emirate called the Masina Empire. Dramatic music in the background, please. If you're new here, my name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. As usual, if you like this content, please hit the like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. If you feel so inspired, you can toss some money my way using the thanks button here, or you can buy me a coffee using the link below. You can also consider becoming a member. It's best to do that in here on YouTube, and that will make you one of the coolest people on earth. As usual, I'm going to divide this video into several parts, and I've got timestamps in the description below so that you can jump around from part to part. Part 1, I'm going to talk about sources. What are my sources? I did this for the previous video about Tuaregs, and it was very well received, and for good reason. It's good to know where I'm getting my information from. And because I want, I'm not ripping the information off of Wikipedia or making this stuff up. Like, no, this is like really good sources. And because I want to provide you a reading list. If you wish to read further, here's a great place to start. Go and read these books. Part 2, defining Central Mali. What even is Central Mali, and what makes Central Mali a distinct place in Mali relative to everybody else? It's not just Central Mali is just the stuff in the middle of the map. That's dumb. No, actually, it's very distinct for some very particular reasons, which I'm going to get into. Part 3, Fulani 101, a very, very, very basic introduction to who on earth are these Fulani people. Part 4, why did Central Mali turn out to be a powder keg? Part 5, a brief history of jihadism in Central Mali. And part 6, thoughts about what needs to be done. Now, before I start, I need to make my shameless plug. I recently published this little book called The French Way of War, 8 Strategy Lessons for Today's Conflicts. This is a distillation of several years of work that I've put in studying basically modern French military strategy, and I extracted some of the most interesting bits, some of the most interesting concepts, and put them in this very short introduction. I think it's fascinating, particularly, of course, if you're interested in France and the French military, it's a no-brainer, but also I think anybody who's interested in these general subjects of military strategy, I would highly, highly recommend this book, because it's an introduction to a very different way of thinking about military strategy, at least different from the way Americans might think about it, or the British or the Germans, and we're well past Clausewitz, so whatever. Anyways, let me put that aside, and I'm going to talk about Mali. Part 1, sources. As with the previous video, I want to begin by discussing more sources. Probably the first place any of you should look if you want to get smart about Central Mali is by looking on the websites of the International Crisis Group and the Human Rights Watch, both of which have done good reports over the years on things happening in Central Mali. Plus, they publish everything in both French and English. So in English, it's really one of the best places that you can go. If you're a French reader, I would also recommend, I think Le Monde has done a very good job of covering these issues, particularly there's that wonderful Le Monde journalist, Morgane Lacam. She's great, but it's only in French. However, there are some books that are really important that I want to highlight. And these are the things that I put links of these books in the description. So if you want to read more, I encourage you to go and do so. The first is really not just any one book, but the collected works of a Malian writer named Amadou Ampete Bey, who died in 1991. I don't actually have any of it with me here. Since about August, I've been actually living as a guest in somebody else's home, which is why most of my books aren't here, and also why I haven't put anything up on the wall, because it's not my wall. But anyways, I have all these books, the Ampete Bas, like here and there, and I could show them off. They're fabulous books. What's amazing about Ba, some of which has been translated into English and available in English, what's amazing about Ba is that he can transport you to an entirely different time and place, an entirely different universe, the universe of Central Mali and Fulani in the late 19th and early 20th century. I think it's amazing. He adds color, he humanizes, he tells stories and tales, he makes it all very three-dimensional, and he also paints a very rich picture of the Islamic culture that was dominant at the time, or at least his version of this Islamic culture. I don't know enough to know the extent to which this Islam that he portrayed was idiosyncratic to him. Maybe it was his projection. I don't know. Either way, it's absolutely fascinating. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. The second thing I want to highlight is a small book by Adam Thiam. You can find it in PDF format. I put a link in the description to that. It's also very good. Again, I have it in my old office. I don't have it here. And third, there's a small study by Amadou Abo called Le Jihad Pool au Sahel Central, the pool or Fulani Jihad of Central Sahel. Again, excellent, excellent, excellent. And third, I want to bring your attention to this book, La Katiba Masina, which came out in January, I think, 2026, by Amadou Diallo. He's a Central Malian. This book is amazing. I absolutely love this book. It's probably the book to read if you want to focus on Katiba Masina, which is the jihadist group that's operating today in central and southern Mali. There's something about this book that I love. You know, most of us Sahel analysts, we're foreigners, and we're people like me. I'm an American. You know, I'm a gringo in America. I live in Washington, D.C., and I know when I know because I've read a bunch of books and read a bunch of stuff on the internet. But that's as expertise goes, I know more than most fellow gringos, but it's very superficial in my knowledge, and I understand that. I really do. So it's particularly valuable to read a book like this that comes from somebody who is from there, a native son who is fluent in the culture, the history, the popular memory, and the languages, of course. And so when he says something is true, when he says that the Fulani thought like this or they spoke like that, I'm going to presume, yeah, he's right, because he's in a position to know, whereas I really am not in a position to know. The best I could do is identify people like Diallo and recognize them as authorities and defer to people like Diallo when he's talking about various things. Also, he was a sort of a first-person witness to certain things, and in this book, it's clear from the sources that he's also interviewing others who were first-person witnesses to some of the events that he describes. And basically, the focus here is on the period in this century, in the emergence of a jihadist movement, and also, but he paints a picture and he talks about the role of the historical memory of the Masina Empire. Let's get to it though. Okay, part 2, defining central Mali. Here I'm showing you a map. This is a map of divided by regions. These are administrative units. Some of these regions are very new because he kind of carved them out of other regions, but the basics here that you'll see is on this map. The border between northern Mali and central Mali is basically the southern border of the Timbuktu region. Yes, this is the French spelling of Timbuktu. So you see below Timbuktu, you see Mopti and Douentza. Mopti and Douentza are part of central Mali. Everything above Timbuktu, Gao, Menaka, that's northern Mali. So central Mali, generally speaking, traditionally is thought of in terms of Mopti, Douentza, Bandiagara, San, and Segu. All told, they have about 25% of the population, which is pretty substantial. The rest of Mali, which is often called southern or southwestern Mali, has 66% of the Malian population. So this gives you an idea. 10% or just under 10% lives in the north, a quarter lives in the center, and 2/3 live in the south. Here, I was playing around with AI and I came out with this pie chart based on the 2022 census. Again, you see 66% are in southern Mali, 24.5% are in central Mali, and 9% are in northern Mali. However, what really, I think, distinguishes central Mali from the rest of the country is the water systems, the wetlands, and what's called the inner delta of the Niger River. Here's a map that shows you kind of roughly where this inner delta is. I don't really know why the Niger River does this at this particular place, but it does. There's this like floodplain, and there are all these tributaries, and at certain times of the year, large parts of this flood, and then the water recedes, and it's a cyclical thing. But this water, the prevalence of water, makes this part of the country distinct from the rest of the place. Here's another view of it. This is from Google Earth. You could see you've got this very drab, brown, arid country, but then there's this greenland here, formed by all the water networks and the flooding areas of central Mali. The flooding areas that flood and recede and become pasture, those are called Burgu. If you look at this picture, this image, on the very bottom left, I circled Segu, and at the very top right, what I circled was Timbuktu. So, in a sense, this area of Mali, this part of central Mali, is bookended by Segu in the southwest and Timbuktu in the northeast. So the wetlands of the delta make this very, very different with respect to how people live. How do they feed themselves? And it also makes central Mali, I said this before in my previous video, it's like a intertidal zone where sweet water and salt water intermingle. So it's where like the herding-based society and means of production of the north and the farming-based society of the south intermingle. And then you've got a lot of people who survive through fishing, so you've got fishing communities. So they intermingle, but it also creates this kind of like a separate universe because of this unique water system. Here's one more way of framing central Mali, which is historically. So first, Remember this map here? We've got this map where we've got this green area that's sandwiched between Ségou in the bottom left and then Timbuktu in the bottom right. Remember that? Now, here's a map that I found on the internet somewhere, Wikipedia maybe even, of the Masina Empire, which is sandwiched by, guess what? You've got Ségou in the bottom left and Timbuktu in the top right. This was a political entity that existed in the 19th century before the French showed up. So what is this? What is this? What is this Masina Empire? Once upon a time, the Fulani communities of central Mali, in this area of central Mali that I'm talking about, paid tribute to a pagan Bambara, so like ethnic southern Malian polity that had its base in Ségou. There's like the Empire of Ségou. By the way, there's a magnificent book series called Ségou by this French writer named Maurice Condé, which is in both English and French, wonderful historical novels about this time period. So that's the deal. There was this dominant Bambara kingdom, or I don't know what it was called, but it was there, and they dominated the area. And the people of this middle area between Ségou and Timbuktu had to pay tribute. Then at some point, there was an Islamic leader named Sékou Amadou who promoted Islam. He helped Islamicize the area, and he rallied many of the Fulanis of the region in a jihad against the Bambara power to the south of them and the Fulani elites who benefited from the existing political dispensation. This, by the way, is and remains an important theme in understanding the political dynamics of the region. Even within an ethnic group, like the Fulani, like the Tuareg, like Songhai, like everybody, there are some who do very well by the status quo, and there are a number who feel excluded by the status quo and resentful of those who are doing well by the status quo. This exists within these dynamics, within these communities, this sort of polarization that takes place internally, not to mention, of course, the relations with the other larger communities, but internally you've got this dynamic, sort of the haves and the have-nots, and the haves and the increasingly resentful have-nots. Amadou, he created what became known as the Masina Empire, or sometimes it's called the Dina, the Masina Dina, or the Fulani Dina. This existed from 1818 to 1862. 1862, it was destroyed by another jihad, a jihadist group led by somebody named Al-Hajj Omar Tal, that came out of the west, basically kind of like from Senegal, this area named Fouta Touro, which you see on the left on the map that I have here. And it was a much more sort of a stricter jihad, but it shifted the political base so that it would then it incorporated Messina into a larger entity. Who are the two couleurs? This is actually a surprisingly difficult question to answer. They are Fulani, but not Fulani. They're like cousins of the Fulani. They speak the same language, from what I understand. There are some societal differences, like the two couleurs supposedly are more into sedentary farming, whereas the Fulani are more associated with herding. But I'm not really sure. And I did read that I think it's like in Wikipedia, actually, somebody said, and I think this might be true. See, not everything in Wikipedia is false. This might be true, that the distinction between Fulani and two couleurs is simply a French colonial invention, because they thought it was useful to separate and bin these two groups on different places in their social hierarchy for whatever reason. I don't know if that's true, but that sort of thing happened. So I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. The Messina fell in 1862 to these people, to the two-couleur empire, and the two-couleur empire, they remained in power for about 30 years until 1893, 92, 93, 94, when they were destroyed by the French. And the French incorporated this entire area into the French Empire. Part 3, Fulani 101. Very, very briefly, and here I'm going to indulge in some gross oversimplifications. Fulani are a large ethnic group, one of the largest in West Africa. They are spread everywhere throughout West Africa. I think you can find them in every country in West Africa. There are millions of them. And there's over an estimated 2 million alone in Mali, so it means they're far more numerous than the Tuareg, although nobody really knows how many Tuareg there are. There are a lot of them. Almost all are Muslim. Many are associated with herding, but there are many Fulani who do other things. They fish and they farm, or they're urban Fulani. They have stores and they're markets, and they have jobs. There are Fulani in the Malian administration. There are lots of Fulani in the Malian military, which is kind of a contradiction to some of the things I'm going to say about the Malian military a little bit later in this video. But the reality is there are a lot of Fulani in the Malian military, and the Malian military is actually remarkably diverse. So if you spend any time, as I have, interacting with Malian soldiers and officers, I guarantee you're going to meet a lot of Fulanis. They're kind of everywhere. They are everywhere in Mali, but they're concentrated in the area that we're talking about in central Mali and in the Masina or the Dina. It's sort of like the heartland of Mali and Fulani. A distinguishing characteristic of Fulani everywhere in Africa is the language, the Fulani language. They all speak some variant of it. Sometimes it's called, just like the Fulani themselves are called, they're called different things. There's Fulbe, I don't even know how to pronounce it. The French call it Poule or Poulard, Fula, different names, more or less same people, same language. And yes, the Fulani, as you could guess from what I've seen, are divided amongst themselves. Between, you've got different social groupings and different hierarchies. Some are elite, some are not elite. You've got lowborn, you've got aristocrats, then you've got lowborn types and commoners and people who used to be slaves from the past. And so you've got these internal social conflicts and social cleavages, and these are the kinds of things that jihadis are very adept at exploiting. I also want to stress that not only are the Fulani within Mali divided and diverse amongst themselves, but every country you go where you find significant Fulani populations, you're going to find a different situation, a different deal in terms of how they're organized and where they are and their interactions, their relations with the state, their relations with the other ethnic groups. I urge you, I beg of you, do not lump all Fulani in the same, not together in the same sack. Do not even the Malian Fulani. Just please try to avoid any discussion of the Fulani. It's never the Fulani, it's some Fulani. So some Fulani are jihadists. Some Fulani are anti-jihadists. So it's not the Fulani. Part 4. Why did Mali, central Mali, become a powder keg that blew up in the 2010s? I've previously described Mali as this meeting place of northern and southern cultures, and it's also its own special, specific thing because of the water, because of the inner delta. It's really very unique. So what happens is that because of the flooding of the Niger River, and then it recedes, there's all this amazing pasture land. So this is a fabulous place to bring your herds of cattle or whatever to graze. And so you've got amazing fishing, you've got this amazing herding grounds, and then you've got great land for farming. So already you've got 3 basic groups that interact and share this space, the fishers, the herders, and the farmers. And not only are there local herders who use it, but you also have mostly Fulanis from the rest of the area, the whole region, all of Mali, who come to central Mali to take advantage seasonally of the pashland in what I described as the burgu, which are these like areas that flood. So you now have this basic separation between, you've got those 3 basic groups, and then you have a separation between people who are local and the outsiders. So even amongst the herders, you've got the local herders and the outsider herders, the ones who show up seasonally. You can imagine how you've got lots of potential for friction and for conflict. Add to this the fact that the population of all of the above have been rising very, very rapidly. Mali has a very, very high population growth rate. So you've got more and more people who are trying to share the same limited resources. Now, dating back at least to as far back as the Masina Empire, there was a, let's call it political dispensation that managed all this and achieved a rough equilibrium amongst all these different groups. So there's a social hierarchy at work, and I think this is really formalized under the Masina Empire, where you've got, well, under the Masina, the Fulanis were generally on top of the whole thing, and so that changed with the fall of the Masina Empire. But still, within the Masina region, and within the Dina, you have the burgu, or access or control of the wetlands and the pastures, that was in the hands of elite aristocratic Fulanis. And you've got commoners who would have to pay some form of taxation to the elites. So you've got the local commoners who would use the land for their herds. But then you've got the outsiders who would come in, and they would have to pay tolls and taxes to the elites, both to access the land and to pass through the land. So you have a system where certain hereditary elites are benefiting from the status quo, while a growing number of people are not, because they are having to pay out to the elites. There's a basic distinction that one finds in literature about the Fulani between, I think the terms are, forgive my pronunciation, the Rimbe, which are aristocratic Fulanis, and low-born Fulanis, former slave Fulanis, who are called Rimabe, however that's pronounced. Historically, they can manage this, and there was just a way of managing it. And and also it's important to keep in mind that who controlled what and who had to pay to whom was understood through tradition and through practice. This is not the case of a formal Western cadastre, where you have clearly defined borders and land titles and you'd have surveyors who go like they do here and like they do in Europe, where they go out and they measure, this is actually the limits of your farm. This belongs to that farmer, that belongs to that farmer. In this case, it's done through heredity, it's done through tradition, it's not formalized, which makes it even more problematic because it's harder to resolve disputes when you can't just go to the courthouse and look up the title documents and the land surveys and that sort of thing. The ability of this system to manage all the conflicts eventually collapsed. And it collapsed for several reasons. For one thing, you have the policies of post-independence Mali, which favored settled agriculture. You have successive droughts. You have climate change. You've got a rapidly growing population. You have corruption on the part of the government. And then you've got lower-born or outsider Fulanis who feel like they're being exploited by the Fulani elites as well as the state. And you've got the state has these corrupt administrators, which means that if you have some sort of conflict and you go to the court or the bureaucracy, chances are they're going to defend the interests of those who can pay them off. So there's this burgeoning sense of injustice. You're getting it both ways, both from your fellow Fulanis who are the elites, but then also from the state. So the whole system, this established system that's ultimately a legacy of the Masina Empire, if not earlier, prevents you from, well, it's oppressing you. It's taking your money. It's taking your resources. The scholar Adam Thiam describes Sahaelian society as confronted with a blocking of the social elevator, which results from the rigidity of, I'm paraphrasing here, rigidity of relations between nobles and former slaves, urban notables and rural populations, hereditary imams, and upstart religious leaders. And then you've got a growing youth, rapidly growing youth, that contests traditional authorities of all kinds while becoming a majority thanks to the high population growth. So more and more Central Malians are young punks who challenge the established system, who challenge the political, the fact that these hereditary elites who want to tax you are in cahoots with the state, who are in cahoots with these traditional religious figures, etc., etc. Thiam writes that impoverished and threatened herders, families from lower social classes, or non-establishment religious leaders share the sentiment of being stuck in their situation or exploited by local elites, inclusion with representatives of the state. So the delta is, again, I'm paraphrasing Thiam, it's mined with corruption and injustice, making it right for any, quote, entrepreneur of a cause, unquote. In this context, I believe it's easy to understand the appeal of the jihadist message, especially given that the Fulani variant being preached by Hamadoun Kouffa, whom I'm going to talk about later, who's the jihadist leader leading the fight in this part of the country. It's a very egalitarian message. It's like, why should anybody pay taxes to anybody else? God created the land, so you should all be able to share it equally. Kouffa also evokes the glory days in the popular memory of Sekou Amadou and the Masina Fulani Empire when the Fulani were the top dog. And so it's this rhetoric that's almost messianic about the return of the glory days and perhaps the return of this great leader who's going to at once revive Islam and revive the glory days of the 19th century jihad of Sekou Amadou. This, according to Diallo, has a lot of appeal among many Fulani of central Mali. Part 5, a brief history of jihadism in central Mali. Obviously, there have been jihadist movements in the past. 19th century, there were two. There was the one of Sekou Amadou, and then there's the Tukulur jihad of Umar Tal. So they existed. But still, it is generally true, oversimplification here, but it's generally true that the Islam as practiced in central Mali was of the sort of classic West African Sufi Tijia, I forget the name, the Sufi Brotherhood, benign. It's very, very different. This is not Wahhabi Islam. This is not Salafist Islam. And there would be these traditional authorities, these Marabu, who'd go around and they'd kind of reinforce. These were sort of the people who would continue this and preserve and promote this kind of Islamic culture that was the mainstay in this area. This was the norm. If you want to get a taste of it, the best way, I think, is by reading Ompate Ba, who gives this incredible depiction of the Fulani Islam of the early 20th century. Now, the way I described it in the previous videos is that sometime in the late 1990s, there was this Pakistani movement called the Tabligh Jamaat, or the Dawa, that showed up, at least in northern Mali. And they managed to recruit some prominent Tuaregs, the most important among them, Eid al-Ghali, to this, either to Salafist Islam or just gave them a taste of Salafism. That ended up intersecting with the arrival of Algerian Salafist terrorists, the GSBC, in northern Mali in the early 2000s. So the Dawa was giving some Malians a taste for Salafism while the actual Salafis show up and the JSPC, which evolved into AQIM, which then became part of JNIM. But the point is, though, that in this time period, the jihadist movement in Mali was primarily a phenomenon of Tuaregs and Arabs, and a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But this is like a northern Tuareg and Arab thing, with some others thrown in for good measure. Then in 2012, a predominantly Tuareg non-jihadist group, the MNLA, launched a rebellion against the state. 3 jihadist groups, one of which was new, the other was basically the GSPC, although rebranded as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. They joined in the rebellion, and then they hijacked the rebellion. They pushed aside the MNLA, and they're the ones who conquered northern Mali and a portion of central Mali up until the French showed up in January of 2013. The arrival of the MNLA was not popular in central Mali, and it pushed some Malians into the arms of one of those jihadist groups, a group called Mujao, M-U-J-A-O. Also, it meant that the Malian state left. MNLA shows up, Malian state leaves. Some of the Fulanis end up teaming up with Mujao because they are a form of resistance against the MNLA. And this was the time when we see emerging a firebrand Fulani preacher named Hamadoun Kouffa, who started off as part of Ansar Dine, and then reportedly he was able to infiltrate Fulani fighters into the town of Kona as part of the January 2013 offensive into southern Mali, which is what precipitated the French intervention of that same month, known as Operation Serval. He was part of Ansar Dine, Kouffa. He recruited a lot of Fulanis, and he basically creates like a Fulani element within Ansar Dine, and that becomes known as the Katiba Masina, named Masina because, right, to hearken to this historic past. Sometimes I've seen references to something called the Masina Liberation Front. It's not clear to me that that ever actually was a thing, but it's best to think about Katiba Masina as a subset of Ansar Dine. So it's a Fulani unit within Ansar Dine. As the French army swept through Mali, they swept through central Mali, and then they went north all the way to Kidal. The Malian state followed in its wake. But this wasn't necessarily good news for Fulanis. To some extent, it might have made matters worse. The return of the state, and the eyes of many Fulanis, meant the return of taxes, the return of corruption, the return of a justice system that they thought was biased against them. It also meant the return of security forces that often targeted Fulanis for collective punishment because of their association with the jihadists, with Mujao, because some Fulani had joined up with Mujao. There have been well-documented human rights abuses because of this association, and even massacres committed against Fulanis. The first of note was in March of 2013, when at least 20 people, mostly Fulanis, were killed in Dungura and thrown into a well. This violence has not been tied to the state, but it took the state at least a year to bother to investigate the crime, which sent a message to all the Fulanis that the state was not really interested in protecting them. State security services subsequently have been responsible for anti-Fulani violence, with state-aligned militias, primarily Dogon militias and Dozos, which are these hunters, sharing responsibility. And then beginning in December 2021, state security forces found a partner in crime in the form of the Russian mercenaries, the Wagner Group, who were at the very least present on numerous occasions when Malian forces allegedly committed acts of violence that targeted Fulani civilians, and he reportedly played a significant role in the massacre committed in Mora in 27 to 31 March 2022. According to eyewitness reports, the Malian soldiers, helped by Russians, targeted Fulanis. They rounded them up. They killed hundreds of them, although they've never officially figured on. There's no official number. And these acts of violence really set off a vicious circle wherein collective punishment against Fulanis furthers their radicalization, resulting in even more violence perpetrated by Fulani jihadists, spurring more collective punishment, etc. And today, in light of the events of 25 April, there's already the phenomenon of at least some Fulanis in Bamako were lynched, and I have heard that a lot of Fulanis were really trying to lay low because they were afraid of getting into trouble with lynch mobs. Jihadists began to return to central Mali through a series of attacks in Mopti and Segu and Kulikuru in the 2016 period. The responsibility for the attacks is very difficult to establish, but generally it's clear that Fulanis increasingly in this period rallied to Kouffa and his Katiba Masina. And the Katiba Masina in 2017 became part of this new coalition called JNIM, which is the group that people talk about most when they talk about jihadist terrorists in Mali. Alongside the jihadist attacks was a steady increase in violence perpetrated by state security forces, primarily against Fulanis, and by various militias that formed in order to resist the jihadists, but frequently did that by attacking Fulanis. The most prominent among them, as I've said, were the ethnic Dogon militias. And then the net result is an aggregate surge in violence in central Mali that continues to this day. Let's talk a little bit more about Katiba Masina. First, you have to ask, who is Hamadoun Kouffa? Hamadoun Kouffa was, from what I understand, a traditional Marabout, more or less cut from the same religious cloth as everybody else, but he radicalized. And according to Diallo, this guy, there was this important step in his radicalization, which was his encounter with the Tabligh Jamaat, sometime at least as early as 2009. I find this useful because, I talked about the Jamaat or the Dawa in the context of these Tuareg leaders in northern Mali, in Kidal, but I didn't really know what had become of them. So apparently, after that period in northern Mali, they began to try to spread a little bit in central Mali, so they were present already in central Mali by 2009. Kouffa gets involved with these characters. Dawa itself apparently is a pacifist movement. It's a quietist movement. These are not like cut your throat jihadist types, but it serves as something like a gateway drug to more hardline and much more violent strands of Islamist Islam. And there were in the sort of the social networks of the Dawa, according to Diallo, all sorts of unsavory figures who were interested in far more extreme variants than what the Dawa itself was actually preaching. He then began to preach more and more against the state, against Fulani elites who benefited from the state, who were in cahoots with the state, with the traditional Islam that was being practiced, that he considered to be impure. So he wanted to purify the Islam. He wanted to rebel. He wanted a jihad, right? But a jihad against the state, a jihad against the Fulani elites, a jihad against the establishment religion of the time. And he preached an egalitarian vision where everybody would either have equal access to the burgu, to the watering grounds and the pasture lands. And he also, though, preached a sort of religious irredentism with respect to bringing back the Masina Empire of Sekou Amadou. So it's both a religious and a political irredentism, because reclaiming the past glories of the Masina Empire and this religious absurgence and purifying the Islam practiced by everybody in central Mali, these things went hand in hand in his vision. There's even something of a messianic element, according to Diallo, this idea that like there's this dream that one day somebody would come and would restore the Masina Empire and restore the glory days of the Masina Empire. And so people are like, oh, maybe Kouffa's the one. And got a lot of people excited. According to the books I referenced, Katiba Masina draws from a number of different groups. By all accounts, mostly these are Fulani, but they come from different groups within the Fulani society. Plus there's some non-Fulani there. So who are these groups? Well, you have one, low-caste Fulani herders from outside central Mali who come seasonally to the water, to the area's pastures. They are subjected to the abuses of the state and exploitation by the hereditary elites who control access to the burgus and who tax them heavily. They are easy marks for Kouffa, who preaches war against the state and against the traditional elites alike. They are forever excluded from attaining higher station. They're frustrated. They seek an end to the elites' tax schemes, and ultimately the entire system inherited from the Masina Empire of managing access to the burgu. According to one of these guys that I read, it's the burgu that's the main goal. But the jihad is then used as a cover for what's ultimately a desire to claim control of this natural resource. A second element within the Katiba Masina, you've got local Fulanis who aren't taxed to enter the burgu, but who nonetheless find their advancement blocked. So they're going to make common cause with the outsiders. There's also Fulani elites who are among those who control the burgu, but they figured out that joining Katiba Masina is a way to avoid losing everything. It's kind of like if you can't beat them, join them. Or rather, Katiba Masina threatens to take away their lands and everything from them. They wish to salvage as much as they can, so they figure they might as well join in, and that way maybe they can salvage something rather than lose everything. You also have another group that he says consists of, Diallo says consists of former cattle thieves, terere. They figured that, it's kind of like they have a choice between you could have your hands cut off or you could join the Katiba Masina. So it's like, oh, Katiba Masina, that sounds great. Then you have Fulanis who have served in the Mujal and received some training before demobilizing after Serval happened. Then you also have the actual Talibé. These are zealous Quranic school students. They are, according to Diallo and others I've read, few in number. And then finally, you've got a lot of people who are just looking for economic opportunities. It should be made clear, very, very clear, that many Fulanis, and I bet most, have not joined Katiba Masina. Some Fulanis even formed their own self-defense groups to defend themselves not just from the Dogon, but also from the Katiba Masina. And they fought against the jihadis, but unfortunately they really suffered because they're caught between two fires. On one hand, they're being attacked by the jihadis. The other hand, they're being attacked by the state. They do not exist anymore as far as I know. And some of their members have since joined the Katiba Masina just because it's safer, right? You join up with the winners. The percentage of Central Malian Fulanis who support Katiba Masina is not known. Any estimate is pure speculation. Okay, conclusion. What we see here is a shift of the jihad and of the wars to Central Mali, and a shift from a conflict in which Tuaregs play a predominant role and Arabs, but to one in which the Fulanis are the main central actors. And what's fueling this are internal dissensions, internal problems, socio-political problems within the Fulani community related to the management of limited natural resources and the inadequacy of an ancient traditional way of managing the natural resources that dates from the Masina Empire. Its inadequacy in the modern day for all sorts of reasons, and it's all kind of broken down. Challenge of the Fulani problem is that of all of this, for one thing, there's a tendency that I mentioned before of people to only think of the conflicts in Mali in terms of the North and the Tuaregs. Well, no. First of all, as you hopefully learned in my previous video, it's really only some of the Tuaregs. But they are irrelevant to the conflict here in Central Mali. They're absolutely relevant. This is all about the relationship among Fulani groups, among Fulani, between Fulani, and then between the Fulani and the state, and also neighboring populations like the Dogon. To the extent that the Malian state understands that there's a problem related to Fulanis in Central Mali, unfortunately their reaction has been to basically target everybody through like targeting, collective punishment, killing people. And it's bad. It pushes a lot of Fulanis into, well, they go into Mauritania where they're now in refugee camps, or a number of them, they go to IDP camps in Mali, or none of them end up saying, well, the heck with that, I'm going to go join JNIM because now I'm really angry. And it's been fairly well documented that that's a relatively common phenomenon. So all it does is it pours fuel on the fire. And the Russians really made this worse. There are also all these terrible instances of mob violence and lynchings where it's almost certain that the victims are Fulani. And anytime you'll hear about some massacre of civilians being killed in Central Mali, odds are very strong that most, if not all, the victims are Fulanis. So to the extent that there's a Fulani problem, the state has to recognize that it needs a policy. It needs a policy for Central Mali. It needs a way to deal with the Fulanis. It needs a way to somehow deal with all of these problems that are making Central Mali. That made Central Mali such the tinderbox for what happened afterwards, a spark that came from the Northern Rebellion that caught on to Central Mali. And by the way, this is what happened to Burkina Faso as well, where the insurgency in Burkina Faso is largely Fulani-driven, and it's the result of its spillover from what's going on in Central Mali. There needs to be a Fulani policy. There needs to be a Central Mali policy. It can't just be knocking heads and killing people, however, and it has to be more nuanced, and there has to be policies that take into account the whole complexity of this situation, everything that's been driving this conflict, having to do with access to the water and the grassland and all that kind of thing. I'm convinced that there will never be peace in Mali unless that's taken, unless there really is a comprehensive approach to diffusing all of the tensions in Central Mali, and thereby stealing the win from the jihadist cells. But it could be too late. Among other things, JNIM has been spreading into southern Mali. They're now all the way in Kai region, which is in southwestern Mali, which is up against the Senegal border, which also happens to be where a lot of the industrial gold mining is going on. So it's vital for the Malian economy. JNIM is now all over the place. And who's doing that? Katiba Masina. They are really very dangerous. So it might even be too late. The jihad, the Fulani jihad, is already metastasized. So it's worrisome. Thank you very much. I hope you liked this video. I hope you found it informative. Please stay tuned. There's a lot more in the pipeline. And also remember, if you look in the description, you're going to find links to my X, my Blue Sky, my LinkedIn, and my own website, michaelsharkin.com, as well as my Substack, which is also called Pax Americana. Thank you, and see you soon. Bye-bye.